In this talk, we'll hear from Svetha Janumpalli, the founder and CEO of New Incentives, which is a non-profit that implements conditional cash transfers programs in Nigeria, which saves lives by increasing the uptake of routine immunisations. With a background in impact evaluation and field research, Svetha has brought policymakers, development researchers, and government partners together to create cost-effective cash transfer programs. She was highlighted as a changemaker by the Clinton Global Initiative, was named a Forbes 30 Under 30 social entrepreneur, and participated in Y Combinator's 2016 NFP batch. Today, Svetha will talk about the power of two kinds of incentives. First, the conditional cash transfers that New Incentives provides to caregivers to get their children vaccinated. And second, the new incentives in the global development sector, which have been spurred by GiveWell and the EA community, and which nudge non-profits to focus on verifiable impact and cost effectiveness. So just as a reminder, if you have questions for Svetha, you can submit them via the Swapcard app, and please make sure you put them in the questions section rather than the chat section. And then after the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. But now, please join me in welcoming Svetha.
Hi, I'm the founder and CEO of New Incentives. At New Incentives, our goal is to save lives cost-effectively. Today, I'd like to tell you a tale of two incentives. I'll talk about the kind we give in our program, which is the heart of what we do, giving cash incentives to increase childhood vaccination rates and save lives. We didn't set out with this program. In fact, we failed many times and in big ways in searching for a cost-effective way to improve and save lives. I'll give you a glimpse into the ups and downs of nearly a decade of piloting, learning, and iterating. And now to using data to ensure that we continue to have an impact at scale. I'd also like to talk about incentives at the macro ecosystem level that make our work happen. I believe that this ecosystem incentive is so powerful that it has the potential to change the way business is done in global health and development in the years to come. Let's first dive into New Incentives. I'll use slides during my talk, but just note that everything I say won't align with the slides. New Incentives provides cash incentives to encourage routine childhood vaccinations. Our local staff provide small cash transfers to caregivers at government clinics after their child receives the latest round of vaccinations. When I say small, the transfers are about $1 per vaccination visit. This may sound simple, but it's not. We operate primarily in regions in Nigeria with limited telecommunications and infrastructure, low mobile phone access, and frequent power outages. These regions are remote, have difficult terrain, and experience high rates of instability and banditry. Kidnapping for ransom is common, and it's hard to get running water. These villages are more neglected than my mother's village in rural India. Our passionate team surmounts countless barriers on a daily basis to do their work. This is one of our team members, Lawan Bako, who traveled over 1.5 hours by canoe to reach an immunization session. The participants in our program are typically mothers, who we refer to as caregivers, and their infants. These women usually live on less than $2 a day, and a good day consists of earning enough to feed themselves and their children. Malnutrition as a source of infant death is common, but not as common as death from preventable diseases. Caregivers face difficult choices and opportunity costs when choosing whether to vaccinate their children, between trying to buy and resell fish, vegetables, or other small goods with very limited funds, to going to the field in the hot sun, with the hope of getting a little crop, or going to vaccinate their babies, which could require transportation costs to the clinic and much of their day. They also may have spouses who, for a variety of reasons, don't want them to go to the clinic or don't want their babies to get vaccinated, in part because the social benefits they've been long promised are almost non-existent. The small monetary incentive we provide helps give mothers a slight leverage against these barriers to take the day to go to a nearby government health facility and get her baby vaccinated and receive a $1 cash grant. She can do this up to 6 times throughout the various stages of Nigeria's routine immunization schedule and receives a bonus amount in the last 2 stages, all in all totaling about $11. Our goal is to increase childhood vaccinations for all vaccines in Nigeria's routine immunization schedule to protect children against deadly yet preventable diseases and save lives. We incentivize each vaccination visit, as you can see. Children in Nigeria need 6 rounds of vaccinations to complete their routine immunization schedule. The 6 visits are supposed to take place at birth or shortly after, at 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 14 weeks, 9 months, and 15 months. We also create awareness about the importance of vaccinations and the existence of the cash transfer program. And we support vaccine supply partners and the government by helping to identify and address bottlenecks in the vaccine supply chain. The cash incentives can be used in any way the caregiver wants, oftentimes going towards transportation, medicine, food, or clothing for their family. Some purchase chickens or fish to provide food and income. In 2020, an independent randomized control trial found that our program doubled the percentage of infants between 12 and 16 months of age who were fully immunized, increasing coverage from roughly a quarter to just over half of all infants. Based on the results, we were recommended as a top charity by GiveWell and have remained a top charity for the last 2.5 years. Since then, donors have supported the program with over $125 million to scale up, and we've grown from operating in 98 clinics in December 2020 to over 4,200 today, a 42-fold increase. This chart shows the number of children we've enrolled each month since August 2017. We have enrolled over 1.4 million infants and dispersed over 4.7 million cash transfers after verifying vaccinations. We are now a team of over 2,000 dedicated staff with more than 1,700 in Nigeria, and we're growing quickly. Today, I'd like to tell you the story of how we got here. Cost-effective and scalable programs don't just happen. It takes determination to follow the data, grit to develop world-class monitoring and systems, and unwavering resolve to keep iterating until you get it right. As you will hear, we were driven by a set of incentives. The funding provided by GiveWell and others in this community that's linked to maximizing impact and cost effectiveness has shaped our values and behavior and improved outcomes. This funding has created an alignment of interests that have led to the creation of a program that is known today as one of the most cost-effective ways to save a life, achieving results for caregivers and infants like Juwaira and Amina. I started New Incentives in 2011 with $300, no fancy degrees, and could barely pronounce the word epidemiologist. I was evaluating domestic government programs by day, and on the side, I was an intern at the Center for Effective Global Action, where I summarized RCT research papers for the new web portal the center was creating. I was astonished by how many papers there were on conditional cash transfers across a wide variety of outcomes, ranging from preventive health visits to school attendance to behaviors like immunization. I had always been a skeptic and critical thinker about development. I have a background in impact evaluation and was perplexed by programs and donors who weren't changing what they were doing based on the data. This is not news to anybody in this room, yet I think it's still the #1 problem affecting international development today. My initial idea was to start a crowdfunding site to enable people to contribute to conditional cash transfers, sort of like a Kiva for CCTs. CCTs were typically only given by governments as part of social safety net programs, and donors didn't have the opportunity to contribute to these or advance them, despite the large body of evidence behind them. I raised seed funding, but soon ran into a significant problem. We had a marketplace where neither side of the market worked. No one was coming to the website. No nonprofits were implementing CCT programs. On one hand, there was an enormous body of academic literature on what does and does not work in conditional cash transfers for a wide range of outcomes pertaining to health, education, workforce training, and a wide variety of other areas. But on the other hand, there were countless nonprofits and charities struggling to deliver results. So I started making phone calls. I personally called hundreds of organizations around the world, but was surprised by the large resistance to paying people for outcomes. Things didn't look good. I went back to my day job as a researcher, working on impact evaluations of nonprofits, and continued new incentives as a side project. This is around the time when I came across GiveWell and Good Ventures. I thought, maybe these guys are different. They use a lot of footnotes. I was intrigued by this new wave of philanthropy that they were championing. I was frustrated with donors and foundations making decisions based on superficial assessments and exaggerated stories of impact. This new approach resonated with me because it was transparent, logical, and based on evidence. In 2014, New Incentives became the first recipient of what used to be called GiveWell incubation grants. The incubation grant was to see if we could take an instrument like CCTs that was widely studied to change a variety of behaviors with social utility and target a highly effective medical treatment to reduce HIV transmission from mothers to infants. I was living in San Francisco at the time. I left my rent-controlled apartment and moved to a small town in Akwa Ibom, Nigeria, with 2 suitcases. I remember GiveWell saying that it could take 10 years to create and scale a highly impactful intervention. Well, they were close. I'm standing here today 9 years after this conversation happened. When I moved to Nigeria, I had no intention to start an NGO in Nigeria. However, after starting to work with the local NGO, we quickly realized that this type of intervention would require establishing detailed systems and processes to track funds, no matter how hard we tried to avoid this. We needed transparency and visibility to iterate and learn, and we weren't getting that transparency. This was our first major pivot to becoming an implementer in Nigeria. My co-founder, Pratyush Agarwal, and I set up a nonprofit in Nigeria called All Babies Are Equal Initiative. This was after the Corporate Affairs Commission rejected the name New Incentives because they said the name didn't properly describe what we do. New Incentives received a grant to measure the effectiveness of using conditional cash transfers to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV. The study found that conditional cash transfers were effective at increasing adherence to life-saving treatment for newborns. Unfortunately, we soon realized that this program, while effective, wasn't scalable. We collected data from hundreds of clinics and realized that the rate of HIV-positive pregnant women attending clinics may be lower than what was reported. The publicly available data simply didn't match up with what we were observing on the ground. Even though the underlying focus of the program was strong and the evidence showed that the cash transfers were working, we knew that it wouldn't be cost-effective at scale. So in 2015, we folded that program and pivoted again, this time beginning a second pilot program for a wider target population. We began exploring using conditional cash transfers to incentivize women with at-risk pregnancies to deliver in health facilities. Based on the LiveSave tool and other research, we thought this could be cost-effective. This is around the time we got into Y Combinator and Incubator, where we learned how to use the power of focus to scale. Very soon, we upped our volume, and we were back at GiveWell's door to be evaluated as a top charity. This time, there were a few major problems with our intervention. The proportion of HIV-positive pregnant women was expected to reduce at scale even further than we expected. And this was a significant driver of the program's benefits. And based on the mixed evidence for facility delivery, some key medical treatments that could be driving potential gains were not associated with what we were incentivizing. There were also important unanswered questions about counterfactual levels of care. In hindsight, we had initial doubts about the evidence behind facility delivery and should have taken those concerns more seriously. We thought they were solvable, but they were deal breakers. At this point, we had a big decision to make. We could either continue working on a program that had a lower impact than we were aiming for. We could argue about why GiveWell's modeling was incorrect. Or we could go back to the drawing board and see if CCTs could be used to change other life-saving behaviors. We chose the last one. We decided to phase out. This was an extremely difficult period. Our entire team had invested in this program and felt emotionally attached to it. I was inspired by GiveWell's objective decision-making and ability to avoid the sunk cost fallacy. This helped us stay focused when we received repeated advice from supporters and advisors to reassess the benefits of facility delivery as an intervention. On one hand, it seemed as though we were met with the seemingly impossible task of finding a cost-effective, evidence-based intervention that had scalability. On the other hand, we were 50% of the way there. Our behavior here was nudged by the ecosystem incentive. If these incentives were not there, we would not have pivoted. We could have sold our facility delivery program to other donors by writing proposals and selling stories. We could have done that, but those were not our values. We wanted a chance to create an enormous impact, and we knew that large resources were necessary to do that and reach lots of people. During this time, we learned some invaluable lessons. We learned that as we grow, we must be increasingly skeptical and ensure this is built into everything we do. If we ever reach a point where we were unable to change our minds based on evidence, we are unfit for the job and have not managed the organization and our partnerships well. After carefully phasing out the facility delivery program, we pivoted to CCTs for routine immunizations. We started collecting data from health clinics about childhood vaccination rates and the challenges caregivers face in getting their children vaccinated. Nigeria has one of the lowest vaccination rates in the world. The country is home to less than 3% of the world's population, yet accounts for approximately 12% of the world's zero-dose children. In 2017, we expanded our pilot program from 10 clinics to 98 clinics for 3 years as part of a randomized control trial conducted by an independent research firm, ID Insight, to evaluate the impact of the program on routine childhood vaccination rates in Zamfara, Katsina, and Jigawa states in Nigeria. During this time, we expanded to a team of 100 plus in 98 public health clinics in the northwest region of Nigeria. The results of the RCT came out in 2020. The RCT found that the program had large, statistically significant effects on vaccination coverage and other key outcomes, including the rate of vaccine stockouts. The effects were consistent across geographies, populations, and types of clinics. Children living in the catchment areas of program clinics had 16 percentage points higher coverage of the BCG vaccine, 21 percentage points higher coverage of the first dose of the pentavalent vaccine, and 14 percentage points higher coverage of the measles vaccine. Importantly, the percentage of children who were fully immunized in the program areas was 27 percentage points higher than in the control areas. The program generated this impact on top of underlying increases in vaccination coverage that occurred in both control and treatment areas, demonstrating that the program complemented existing efforts. Caregivers in the areas where the program operates also had better knowledge of and more favorable attitudes towards immunization as compared to their counterparts not receiving the program. In addition, government clinics with the program were 18 percentage points less likely to report vaccine stockouts during the last 12 months. This time, we nailed it. The program had evidence of increasing vaccinations, and vaccinations had evidence of reducing infant deaths. The program was scalable and cost-effective, with large potential room for more funding. We had developed a track record and communicated transparently. Finally, New Incentives became a GiveWell top charity. At this point, in late 2020, we had a program that worked in 98 clinics. So now what? The best results are worth nothing if we cannot scale them up. The RCT helped show that this could be one of the most cost-effective ways to save a life, if we could deliver reliably. We had a lot of questions. How should we scale? Will the cash transfers get to the right people? How would we be able to prevent fraud and leakage? How would we know if children are getting vaccinated? What if there were not enough vaccine supplies or there were negative effects because of the incentives? Would the program work in new contexts? How would we be able to know? How can we manage risks? What about security issues? How could we ensure continued strong government buy-in and support at scale? How could we measure whether the program was working at scale outside of the RCT context? We had hundreds of questions. Fortunately, we also had an ecosystem where donors incentivized us to answer these questions while taking a chance on us. In order to keep funding and remain a top charity, we had to keep costs low and scale with quality and fidelity to the original design. We had to figure out a way to monitor what we were doing. Here, our incentives were aligned. If we were not able to scale cost effectively, we would no longer be able to raise funds, and we'd end up in the graveyard of research that worked in concept, but fizzled out at scale. We knew we would have to meet a very high bar to continue receiving funding. The results of cost effectiveness analysis and the top charity recommendation rest on certain assumptions regarding cost per child, increases in vaccination coverage, baseline vaccination rates, duplicate enrollments, and so many other variables. We now needed to find a way to deliver this at scale with quality and fidelity to the original design and keep costs low. In order to keep funding, we needed to figure out a way to monitor what we were doing at scale. We aim to be a program that enrolls over 2 million infants, disperses over 10 million cash transfers, and encourages over 28 million vaccinations a year. There is a spectrum of ways to do that when it comes to efficiency and quality. We had to develop new competencies at scale to measure our impact. For this reason, we conduct household surveys before we expand to an area to measure baseline immunization coverage, and every 6 months after we start operating in a new area. These coverage surveys are conducted in accordance with a sampling protocol developed by ID Insight. With these surveys, we get to learn where the program is increasing vaccination rates, and importantly, where it is not. We can then use this data to improve. These standards align our interests with those of caregivers and infants. They make us accountable to delivering the best program we can because we know that the results drive future funding and that if we don't increase immunization coverage cost effectively, we will need to phase out. With all of this data, we have continuous feedback loops that allow us to pinpoint issues, iterate, and improve. We have data-driven implementation at each step and then share this data with partners for collective improvement. In a world without funders driven by these values, new incentives would either not exist or not be as cost-effective. When incentives are aligned, the magic happens. If our incentives were to generate the most heartstring reports we could, we would be incentivized to spend more energy on marketing and communications and less on delivery. Because of the way we are set up, with donors holding us accountable for delivering the best possible value for money to program participants, we innovate at the last mile. Nonprofits are often sitting between donors and who they are serving, trying to pick which side is the customer, not us. Because of this ecosystem incentive, we can operate differently. One of the things you learn quickly when starting to engage in global health and development is that the donor is too often the primary client. They are the customer because they are the ones paying for the program. The only problem is sometimes their interests are different from the interests of recipients. This is a fundamental feature of philanthropy. Nonprofits often need to satisfy many stakeholders at every stage who are looking to mold organizations to their nuanced objectives. This warps decision-making away from verifiable impact. By funding a new type of values, this community incentivizes us to continue prioritizing infants first at scale and provides us with the leverage we need to do that. The ecosystem incentive positions philanthropists to behave and wield influence like customers, to incentivize organizations to deliver. We can finally correct the who is the customer structural problem in nonprofits. Our interests are 100% aligned with those of infants since our donors are 100% driven by cost effectiveness and performance. Disruption is often not a term associated with nonprofits, except when it comes to novel ways of raising funds, like growing a mustache. The disruption is often not at the level of transparency, cost effectiveness, and operational capabilities. We have a data-driven approach that allows us to focus on delivering value to infants. We have standard operating procedures that could make an army blush. Rather than convincing supporters to dump buckets of ice water on their heads, we've spent a lot of time tracking buckets. It's not sexy, But if we can track and verify the location of a bucket, then we've built a system that can verify that supplies are getting to their intended location, that staff are where they say they are, and that cash actually makes it into the hands of the caregivers. It's not about tracking the bucket. It's about verifying everything that we do and continually working towards excellence in program delivery. This is very hard to do in remote areas because of countless infrastructure challenges. Communities that are traditionally left out of the health system face compounding issues. Because when delivery does occur, it is often even more difficult to achieve the visibility necessary to know whether things are working. By demonstrating rigorous operations in these areas, we can increase accountability where it matters the most. We maintain 121 program monitoring indicators, allowing us to keep a constant pulse on areas such as enrollments, retention, vaccine supply, safety and security, expense reporting, audits, recipient satisfaction, and CCT adherence. I'd like to give you a peek behind the scenes. I won't go into the following dashboards in detail, but I'd like to give you a snapshot of our approach. Here we can see top-line metrics. This shows a glimpse of some of the vaccines that program participants received by month. This shows the percentage of clinic immunization sessions we are attending. This month, we've attended over 12,000 so far. It also shows the rate of vaccine stockouts, the number of infants not served, whether vaccines are expired, the average number of infants we're serving per day, and whether minimum required information is being collected. We can see months where we experienced issues due to elections and demonetization earlier this year. Now let's look one layer further. Last week, we missed 550 immunization sessions and properly serviced 4,900 immunization sessions. This shows us where we are leaving impact on the table. Now let's peel the onion further. When we look at metadata for days where we delivered cash incentives, we can see that out of 2 million CCTs dispersed last year, we detected potential significant issues in approximately 5% of those disbursements. We focus a lot on data validation and utilization, not just collection. Off-site teams review information to assess authenticity. So that means last year, our console team reviewed 2 million CCT disbursements, verifying multiple data points, some of which are shown here. This is how we can verify time, location, and whether we are delivering the program to fidelity. We combine digital and analog approaches to authenticate information in remote areas. We employ these systems down to the last detail in order to assess whether the cash reaches the intended recipient and whether vaccinations were actually administered to infants. We have sophisticated systems and procedures to track expenditure. We incur over 15,000 expenses per week. Here you can see an example of individual staff office fund reconciliation we carry out weekly in order to be able to operate in remote areas cost-effectively with a high degree of oversight. We triangulate data to understand where work is taking place, identify falsification, and ensure that we are delivering. Auditors visit a sample, and we cross-check audits against other information to identify blind spots. We apply this level of detail once we start operating in an area, but we also apply this level of detail before we even start operating when measuring baseline immunization rates and deciding where to work in the first place. Here we can see which households were surveyed to evaluate whether the protocol to measure immunization coverage is being followed. This is important to ensure the robustness of the surveys and achieve a representative sample. We go from ant view to bird's eye data so that we can ensure we reach as many children as possible in a cost-effective manner. Here we can see that we have a ways to go to reaching the whole infant population in some of the areas we are working in. This level of detail gives us precision, which matters because if things are not done properly, vaccines won't be administered, infants won't be served, immunization rates will not increase or could in fact decrease, and lives won't be saved. If disbursements are not proper, caregivers are not treated well, and vaccines are not documented, how can we expect the government to scale vaccine supply? Risk management, having foresight in the right areas, and improving controls across the board is the key to our ability to scale the program in a cost-effective manner. The impact we are having as an implementer isn't our only impact. We are starting to see indications of lateral effects in this space as well. When we operate in this fashion, others can see. Everyone wants efficiency. Much larger and more influential institutions are starting to watch and take notice. They are impressed by our numbers. As we reach larger levels of scale through support from this community, we can demonstrate values of cost effectiveness, evidence, and transparency at scale. Operational delivery grounded in these values is the best way to propagate these values to the larger ecosystem. We can demonstrate that these values are a competitive way to achieve shared objectives. By producing results, we can influence the standard for how things should be done. Gavi recently issued a $100 million RFP that includes demand-side incentives, and the objectives they stated match those found by the program RCT results. Other large global health organizations are starting to explore demand-side strategies to improve uptakes in regions with large numbers of zero-dose children. Actors in the space are interested in the granularity of our data. This information is increasing transparency and visibility into gaps in immunization coverage and the health system. So what's next? Between 2017 to 2020, we averaged 6,500 enrollments a month and operated in 98 clinics in 3 states. In January of this year, we enrolled 94,000 infants. We are still rapidly scaling our program, and our next big goal is to reach 2.5 million infants annually across 16 cost-effective states in Nigeria. This would allow us to enroll a total of 9.9 million infants by the end of 2026. But this is just the beginning of our potential impact. As we lay these train tracks, we will explore new opportunities to increase impact. This may consist of going to new countries in the coming years. But what we are most excited about is going deeper in Nigeria. We think the CCTs have the potential to increase coverage even more in areas where we are getting rates from, say, 30% to 60%. There may be other interventions that were previously not cost-effective that could become cost-effective when coupled with this intervention to improve child health. We plan to test ways to further integrate the program with the health system, learn more about the optimal duration of the program and externalities at scale, and identify whether there are ways to bring down costs further in regions with moderate cost effectiveness but higher mobile phone access to learn just how big the potential of this intervention could be. I hope this community will double down on supporting the direct delivery programs that are saving lives today and helping children like Safwan. Not only are we confident these programs are cost-effectively improving health outcomes and saving lives, But there's also a ripple effect that I believe is starting to influence larger actors. Let's keep the momentum programs like this are having. Your support helps infect others in the space with data-driven values. Thanks to everyone here who has supported our dedicated team over many years and stuck with us through many failures. Now, the question is, will you help us build upon this blueprint that has the potential to disrupt global health and development in the years to come? Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Svetha. There is a lot to be inspired in that, that talk. That was amazing. I'll just remind everybody that we've got about 15 minutes for questions, so if you have any questions, please put them in the swap card app, and you can also vote for questions that you particularly want answered. But yeah, as I said, lots to be inspired there. I think one of the things that I find personally most inspiring is that when you're faced with the evidence that the care centre delivery program wasn't as impactful as you might like it to be, that you kind of acted on that and were able to pivot towards something else. Yeah. I think, like you suggested, I think there are a lot of people that, instead they would try to kind of find some way to avoid that evidence and persist with something that they'd invested in emotionally as well.
Yeah. It's easy to have wishful thinking.
Yeah, exactly. We do have one question from somebody that's along similar lines. So Sarah asks if you could talk a little bit more about the switch from switch to CCTs from facility-based deliveries. CCTs for immunisation from the facility-based deliveries. So during this, did you pause your operations on the ground while you conducted the research on the best new approaches, or how long did it take to wrap up that process?
Mm-hmm. So we continued the program we were phasing out, and we worked with stakeholders, communities, because first our responsibility was to phase that out well. We had to think, okay, how are we going to apply any benefits there, work with the clinics and the caregivers to understand why this was being phased out and address their concerns. Then in parallel, we decided, okay, what is the structure of our team? What are our government partnerships? And we had to figure out how to motivate people to phase out and then take a chance on something else that wasn't proven. And so then that's how we started to, in tandem, pilot the CCTs for Immunization program and gain the buy-in to experiment for one new thing. And I think that really demonstrates the importance of relationships, because here were people who, they had to take another chance on us. And people who were so invested in the clinics, invested in facility delivery, now they had to permit us to work in their same clinic maybe for an immunization program.
Yeah, makes sense. There's another question here, which is from Tim, who says that the infrastructure for monitoring the vaccinations process and dispersing cash looks super impressive. Did you guys build it yourselves? How have you considered sharing the details of how it's done to help other NGOs or governments monitor their own programs?
Yes. So we try to do everything in the most resourceful, agile way possible. So we use all types of no-code tools and available systems, and then try to adapt those to suit our purposes. So that's really how we can build extremely quickly. So all of the challenges when we started scaling up or in our previous pivots, we'd have to build entirely new systems in the matter of sometimes a few weeks. And so we also have to be able to iterate those systems in new contexts, use cases, and geographies. So I think now, today, there's so many available tools that you don't need a team of tons of engineers to do these things. Most of the systems we have, we built with essentially a team of 5 developers.
Yeah, it's very impressive. Very cool. I guess along similar lines, there's a question here from Tom about if there are any governments that are implementing conditional cash transfer programs for vaccinations or otherwise. So if your approach is effective, wouldn't it be best to try to get governments to adopt these and apply them at scale?
Yeah. Absolutely. Governments are the ones that invented these programs. They spend over $50 billion a year on these for all different types of areas. Ages, behaviors, different structures, payment sizes, payment modalities. And so our goal is to see how we can demonstrate a more cost-effective type of CCT program and then demonstrate that for the government to adopt. So if we look at Latin America and Asia, where these programs are more widely used, we need to prove that they work in contexts like Nigeria, because the same payment modalities that were successful, let's say, in Latin American countries are not going to be successful in Nigeria. And then we want to show that we can do these things with accountability. And so one of the big problems of sometimes CCT programs don't work is, well, are the payments getting made? Mm-hmm. And so even Nigeria has CCT programs, and the government is very innovative at experimenting with SureP and other types of cash transfer strategies. So we really see ourselves as being able to pilot and demonstrate in new types of applications for the government to consider adopting for new types of problems where maybe they weren't applying CCTs, they're struggling with results, and now we can show them that this type of approach could work.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think in the talk you mentioned that you were planning on working more within Nigeria. We've also got a question about whether you have considered expanding beyond Nigeria and working in other country settings.
Yes, yeah. We have. That is definitely part of our strategic plan. We've done a scoping exercise to identify other potential countries where this application could work based on the barriers, population, operational needs. And essentially, though, what we really assess is the cost benefit. We look at what is the cost of going to a new country, how many infants would we serve, what would be our impact and cost effectiveness from increasing our presence in Nigeria. And we also factor in diversification, risk management, but also now as we gain larger scale in Nigeria, we also have a lot more potential, because now we have a lot of incredible state partners, and now that we have this kind of infrastructure layer, there's a lot of other things we can be doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's also a question, I think you talked a little bit about it in the talk, but and you've got the systems in place, but have you had to deal much with fraud? Is that something that you've come across? And if you do, what's the process for, I guess, detecting and dealing with that?
Yes. We deal with multiple types of fraud. So fraud could be anywhere from the perspective of falsifying expenses. They could be enrolling duplicate beneficiaries, fake beneficiaries. It could be changing the infant who comes back for the subsequent immunization. It could be faking recording of vaccinations. It could be, a host of so many things. And so that's really why we build the monitoring, to understand, what's going on, address loopholes, and then plug these loopholes quickly. And I think that's just part of scaling. You really have to be checking everything to know what you're missing and refining. And the people who benefit from the most are the caregivers, because they love that this is a program that actually pays out. We actually are paying out reliably. We're helping them get vaccination services. So it's really exciting to work on things like fraud, because the accountability benefits are beneficial to your end users. And that's what makes the system tick.
Yeah, makes sense. We've got a couple of questions here related to, I guess, the logistics of scaling. So one is around just how did you manage to scale so fast, and do you have lessons for other NGOs that might be helpful in that space? And then I guess another aspect of the question from Caitlin is that how do you manage to, I guess, keep the supply of vaccinations, managing that to scale up as your program scales?
Yep. So the first question, we invest a lot in being lean and agile. So we really try to recruit doers and builders. And to scale, we want to be quick and nimble. And so the best way to do that is really to have accountability. So from the junior to senior levels, we always err on the side of open channels, open communication. And that's what keeps us honest and grounded, and that's what enables us to move quickly. Because oftentimes when you start to scale an organization, suddenly you realize you have an organization just to fill the needs of the organization. That seems pretty stupid. And so we really try to really move quickly. And the key to that is hiring fast, firing fast, and being very accountable with our time. And so we pride ourselves on saying no to 90 things and yes to like the right 10 things, because we have to make a lot of hard decisions because we want to keep our focus. Every day, everything we do, we think about the cost. How many infants would that serve? How is that affecting our bottom line? And so at scale, there's so many distractions. And so the key is to stay very lean and very focused.
Yeah.
And then, scaling vaccine supplies is, the number one thing we think about. And there we work really closely with our government partners who are putting in tremendous effort to scaling not only vaccinations, but also clinic services. And then we can take our information and feed it back to the government, because the government could have concerns about, is there vaccine wastage? Are these incentives really increasing demand for vaccination? So by having transparency, we can actually start to gain the support for the government to invest more in vaccinations. And so using that data, we can prove that we're actually increasing vaccinations, and then we can start to be more proactive. So we've only started to learn that maybe in like the last half of our scale-up period so far. So working with clinics, looking at their utilization reports, trying to think more state, regionally, zonal. Okay, what is the vaccine supply? So something we do with partners is we have convenings, we get cold chain officers in the same place, and we do things like ask for physical stock counts. So we really try to see, do a landscape, what's existing, and then what are the bottlenecks. And then if we help the government fill those bottlenecks, then the government is very motivated to scale vaccine supply.
Yeah, makes sense. I've got a couple of questions about the choice around I guess the intervention of conditional cash transfers, so why you went with that model rather than, for example, SMS reminders for immunisations. And also a related question is how you came up with the amount of cash to provide as part of the transfer.
Yes, because the CCTs just seem to have so much untapped potential. Like, the body of evidence behind them is so strong because you know where they don't work and for what behaviors they don't work and what structures. And so when looking at something like SMS reminders, we really wanted to work in areas where we could have a very big impact. And so we also wanted to work in areas where immunization rates were low. And so sometimes when you see other demand side strategies, you see very small marginal gains. And also sometimes those gains are in areas where baseline immunization coverage is higher. So we wanted to focus on proving something that could be applied to a variety of applications.
Yeah, makes sense. We've only got a couple of minutes, but we can probably squeeze in a few more questions.
Okay.
One which I think is probably a good, useful advice for everybody is, do you have any advice for dealing with government partners or engaging government partners?
Yes, definitely. My advice is to engage from day one. The government can be very intimidating, but they're extremely collaborative. When we started working in Nigeria, we'd go to government partners and we would design our program cards with them. We'd visit clinics with them. We'd talk about the program structure with them. We get agreements, through different connections because people have, gone to the clinic, they see the need, and they inspire others to act. And so I think the best thing is it takes a long time to build a very solid working relationship, but if you're doing it from day one, people understand. And I think that's the biggest thing to buy in, is people need to feel that they understand what you're doing. And so oftentimes we underestimate the interest in the details by the government. But we've found that when we bring them into those details, they are really wanting to be strong partners. And that's really helpful because in the future, when we have research or things go wrong or things fail, they're working side by side us to improve them. And of course, we can only operate with their approval because these are their clinics, they're providing the vaccinations. Our goal is just to be a helpful complement. And so if we're not embedded in that way, we're not actually incentivizing a service for uptake. We wouldn't get the leverage and cost effectiveness if we weren't working in that manner.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess a final question. So we've got a question here which is partly about dealing with policymakers, and sorry, the question's from Stephen. But the second part is around reaching a broader array of funders, and it kind of relates to a question that I have is about how you've seen the impact of GiveWell and I guess the incentives that's provided by the GiveWell community and the EAG community. Have you seen that kind of roll out into the broader philanthropic community and development community?
Yeah, that's an exciting question. I just had a call recently where a large institution kind of talked about this exact blueprint. They said, we shouldn't have the same entity be the rowers, the steerers, and the evaluators. And so that's exactly what this ecosystem incentive did. And because now that we can prove these results at scale, then other funders and other institutions are also thinking like that. Because, especially in Nigeria, if we expect the government to do everything, how can they do everything and then also, play the core responsibility of a regulator? And so I think there is a shift among institutions to separate these roles to get more accountability for recipients.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, great. Thank you so much for this talk. I believe you're now doing office hours directly after this.
Yes.
Okay, and I think it should be in Swapcard, the location of those. But yeah, please join me in thanking Svetha.
Thank you so much. Thank you.